When a solitary stream of ambient air strikes a vertical obstacle, the fluid does not gracefully part and reunite. It fractures. It tears into a violent succession of microscopic, low-pressure eddies that peel away from the leeward surface in an alternating rhythm, forcefully dragging the object side to side. You perceive this microscopic structural assault as a gentle flutter in the breeze. Physics recognizes it as aerodynamic debt. The universal human illusion is that to harvest the immense kinetic energy of the atmosphere, we must construct colossal rotating blades to physically slice through the sky. We are fundamentally wrong. The most efficient way to extract energy from a fluid in motion is not to sever the wind. It is to let the wind shake a stick. In the autumn of 2021, a quiet aerospace engineer stood on a wind-swept hillside outside Avila, Spain. He was watching a slender white cylinder, roughly the height of a man, vibrating rhythmically in the ambient breeze. There were no blades. There was no rotor. There was no gearbox. There were absolutely no moving mechanical parts a layman could point to. Yet, wired to a small inverter at its polymer base, that $90 prototype was silently feeding alternating current into a farmhouse that had not paid a single electricity bill in 14 months. The neighbors assumed he was clinically insane. The local monopoly utility dispatched 2 technicians to verify the seemingly fraudulent meter readings. They inspected the wiring. They examined the motionless white mast. When they finally walked away, they did not say a word, because what had been built refined from a fluid dynamics principle, the global wind energy industry has deeply understood, since the Tacoma Narrows Bridge violently collapsed in 1940, threatens a financial structure far larger than a desolate hillside in Castilla. It threatens the entire 3-bladed turbine empire. It threatens the deeply entrenched monopoly that the massive multinational corporations have spent the last 3 decades convincing the global population is the sole method for harvesting wind. Furthermore, it threatens the rooftop solar lobby. Placed in the correct wind corridor, this little motionless stick produces roughly 50% more usable electrical power per dollar than an equivalent photovoltaic panel array. It demands none of the strict south-facing roof requirements. It suffers none of the inevitable inverter degradation over time. It requires absolutely none of the $70,000 lithium-ion battery walls you were aggressively marketed. Why has nobody told you about this phenomenon? Because the corporations that sell utility-scale turbines operate on a model of engineered dependency. They do not want you to comprehend that the kinetic energy of moving air can be localized. And the United States Department of Energy quietly knows this. Their own Wind Energy Technologies Office published a comprehensive technical brief in 2018, document number DO 1798. In this publication, they directly acknowledged that bladeless vortex-induced vibration generators demonstrated profound viability. I will quote their assessment directly. They showed significant promise for distributed residential generation at price points unreachable by conventional horizontal axis turbines. That technical brief was formally cited twice in the literature. Then, it abruptly ceased to be referenced in any Department of Energy residential wind guidance. Discontinued is the incorrect terminology. Quietly buried is the accurate clinical assessment. The rationale for this burial was not technical. The rationale was entirely financial. The entire American wind subsidy architecture, from the production tax credit to the investment tax credit extensions, legally codified in 2015 and subsequently renewed under the Inflation Reduction Act, was meticulously built around utility-scale, 3-bladed mechanical behemoths that cost between $3 and $4 million per megawatt installed. A $90 stick on a residential roof does not fit that economic model. It destroys it. Let me meticulously trace the origins of this device, the exact physics governing its operation, and why an Amish carpenter I observed last spring in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has possessed a homemade iteration humming steadily on his dairy barn ridge since 2019. It powers his cold storage room compressor and his workshop lighting without ever once paying his local rural electric cooperative a single cent. The underlying physical principle is classified as vortex-induced vibration, universally abbreviated as VIV in the structural engineering literature. It is the precise mechanical phenomenon that destroyed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge on the 7th of November 1940. On that morning, A sustained 40-mile-per-hour wind set the immense suspension deck oscillating in a perfect resonant frequency. The kinetic energy compounded until it ripped the carbon steel structure apart in front of rolling newsreel cameras. For 90 years, civil engineers have analyzed that black and white footage and treated vortex shedding as the absolute enemy of architecture. You design suspension bridges, industrial smokestacks, transmission antennas, and skyscrapers specifically to disrupt and avoid it. But in 2012, a localized team of Spanish engineers posed the inverse physical question. What if, instead of continually fighting vortex shedding with brute structural mass, you intentionally tuned a flexible structure to perfectly resonate with it? What if you harvested that violent oscillation as direct electricity? They incorporated a small entity in an agrarian village in Spain. Their initial working prototype reliably produced 100 watts continuous in a steady 14-mile-per-hour wind. Their current optimized residential unit is rated at 100 watts peak output. It stands roughly 2.5 feet tall. It weighs exactly 33 pounds. If you construct it yourself from off-the-shelf industrial components, a pultruded carbon fiber rod, neodymium magnets, a coiled copper stator, and a flexible polymer base, the complete bill of materials prices out at under $90 American. When available, the commercial unit retails for approximately €250, though their manufacturing capacity cannot match the quiet global demand. What is happening at the microscopic physical level? When ambient wind passes a rigid vertical cylinder, the fluid dynamic flow does not smoothly wrap around the leeward side. It separates into alternating vortices. These are miniature, high-velocity spinning eddies that forcefully peel off one side of the cylinder, then the opposite side, then the initial side again, in a highly predictable mathematical rhythm. This oscillating wake is called the Karman Vortex Street, named for the brilliant Hungarian-American physicist Theodor von Karman, who perfectly described the fluid separation mathematically in 1911. As each vortex detaches, it exerts a microscopic lateral pull on the cylinder. If the cylinder is entirely rigid, this alternating lateral force induces cumulative stress fractures. This is the exact reason every tall steel smokestack in North America features helical strakes welded to its upper exterior to aggressively disrupt the vortex shedding. However, if the cylinder is intentionally flexible at the base and precisely tuned so its natural mechanical frequency perfectly matches the vortex shedding frequency at the most common local wind velocities, the structure enters resonance. The cylinder begins to violently oscillate. The absolute tip of the mast traces a continuous figure-8 pattern in the air, achieving about 3 to 4 inches of total lateral deflection. At the base of this mechanism, the physics transition from kinetic to electromagnetic. The carbon fiber rod acts as a lever against a vertical stack of alternating neodymium magnets. These magnets are surrounded by dense copper wire coils. As the rod oscillates, the magnetic fields continually wash back and forth across the copper. The vibration becomes alternating current. There are 0 internal bearings. There is no gearbox to fracture. There is no yaw motor to continually align the device with the wind. There is nothing to lubricate. There is nothing to catastrophically fail during a winter ice storm. The United States Oak Ridge National Laboratory executed independent, rigorous fatigue testing on a nearly identical resonant generator architecture in 2019. You will find this in study reference ORAN LTM 20191247. Based on the material degradation curves, the laboratory projected a structural service life of roughly 36 years under continuous, aggressive oscillation. That is roughly double the rated lifespan of a residential 3-bladed microturbine. It is triple the heavily caveated, warranted lifespan of a typical rooftop solar panel. The Amish carpenter never reviewed the Oak Ridge metallurgical fatigue analysis. He consumes a localized Amish periodical and his King James Bible. Yet, this agrarian intuitively grasped a fundamental engineering truth that modern industrial society has systematically scrubbed from its collective memory. Sitting on the shaded porch of his white clapboard farmhouse, watching his 2 daughters shell peas into a galvanized steel bucket, he articulated a profound diagnosis of modern infrastructure. The English world, he observed, perpetually hunts for the machine containing the absolute maximum number of moving components. The Amish deliberately seek the machine with the absolute fewest. Having encountered a brief schematic of a vortex generator, in a circulating homesteader pamphlet, he required exactly 1 weekend to construct his own. He utilized a 6-foot span of common fiberglass driveway marker. He extracted a dense stack of magnets from the core of a discarded microwave oven. He salvaged enameled copper wire from a scavenged electrical transformer. For the structural pivot, he purchased a highly flexible silicone boot from a local agricultural supply store for precisely $11. His total capital expenditure calculated out to $78 and minimal change. That singular, unpainted fiberglass rod, securely bolted to the ridge cap of his dairy barn, now consistently generates between 60 and 110 watts whenever ambient wind velocity surpasses 9 miles per hour. According to historical meteorological data, those specific kinetic conditions exist approximately 73% of the calendar year. 60 watts flowing continuously, 24 hours a day, mathematically yields 1.5 kilowatt-hours of electrical energy every single cycle. That seemingly minute output is ruthlessly efficient. It provides more than sufficient power to run his thermal cold storage compressor on a timed-duty cycle. It powers the brilliant LED arrays illuminating his woodworking shop. It continually charges a modest chemical battery bank utilized strictly for the portable lanterns his family carries between outbuildings in the absolute dark. He has not remitted a single fractional payment to the regional grid monopoly for those localized circuits in over 4 consecutive years. The grid was bypassed by a driveway marker. I am intimately familiar with the reflexive objections to this technology. The moment you introduce localized kinetic harvesting, a chorus of highly conditioned skepticism invariably rises. Let us dissect these objections with clinical precision before we advance. The primary objection centers on atmospheric moisture and condensation. The common assumption dictates that any electrical component left fully exposed to the elements will inevitably rust, aggressively corrode, or incubate destructive mold within the sensitive internal copper coils. The reality of fluid dynamics and material science provides a definitive countermeasure. A properly engineered vortex unit utilizes a completely encapsulated lower alternator section. The stators are deeply potted in a solid block of hydrophobic epoxy resin. The only interface with the atmosphere is a single, microscopic breathing membrane, structurally identical to the material used in premium outdoor apparel. This crude homemade unit has already survived 4 brutal Pennsylvania winters. This includes the catastrophic polar vortex atmospheric event of February 2021, when ambient temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The internal electrical resistance of his hand-wound coils has not shifted by a single measurable ohm. The second reflexive objection involves geographical climate. Does this kinetic conversion function in the arid expanse of Arizona, the humid flatlands of Florida, or the coastal ridges of Maine? The viability is dictated by one strict physical metric: average sustained wind speed measured at 10 meters above ground level, the international standard for anemometer data. Consult the exhaustive wind resource maps freely maintained by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. The telemetry clearly demonstrates that roughly 78% of the continental United States experiences sustained average wind velocities exceeding 8 miles per hour at standard residential rooftop elevation. That vast geographic footprint encompasses the majority of the Great Plains, the entire Atlantic seaboard extending north from Virginia, the Texas Gulf Coast, the agricultural expanse of the California Central Valley, and surprisingly massive tracts of the desert Southwest, where afternoon thermal updrafts create fierce, reliable wind corridors. The only true geographic dead zones are the densely canopied forests of the deep Southeast, where immense biological friction drops surface wind below the threshold of kinetic utility, alongside specific, sheltered valley pockets in the Appalachian chain. For the vast majority of the remaining continent, a simple vortex unit mounted to a roof ridge or an isolated 10-foot mast in a suburban backyard will reliably produce usable current. The third objection is strictly financial. The consumer mind assumes that a $90 price tag is a structural impossibility, masking a prohibitive hidden expense. Let us itemize the physics of the transaction. A 6-foot pultruded carbon fiber rod, procured from an online recreational kite supplier for approximately $22. A vertical stack of 40 N52 grade neodymium magnets, half an inch in diameter, sourced directly from an industrial supplier for approximately $18. A half-pound spool of 28-gauge enameled copper wire, costing exactly $14. A flexible polyurethane base coupler, procured at any local hardware franchise for $11. A standard electrical bridge rectifier, and a highly basic $5 charge controller. Weather-sealed mounting hardware, heavy lag bolts, and a watertight junction box, adding $15 to $20. Your absolute final material cost stabilizes between $85 and $95, strictly dependent on the efficiency of your supply chain. That is the uncensored bill of materials. The fourth and final objection questions mechanical durability. How long will an incessantly vibrating mast survive structural fatigue? Recall the Oak Ridge National Laboratory projection. 36 continuous years for the carbon fiber element. The rare earth components themselves degrade at a microscopic rate. They lose precisely 1% of their total magnetic field strength per decade under baseline operating temperatures. Therefore, even after 40 years of continuous atmospheric exposure, the electrical output drops only by a negligible, fractional margin. The flexible polyurethane base coupler represents the single, soft, consumable component in the entire kinetic architecture. It will require physical replacement every 10 to 15 years. The cost of that replacement is exactly $11. That is your complete maintenance schedule. One $11 polymer boot, replaced once per decade. If you comprehend the mechanics discussed thus far, you possess a greater understanding of distributed kinetic generation than 99% of the heavily credentialed renewable energy consultants currently charging exorbitant fees to explain why a vortex unit is a physical impossibility. The complete architectural blueprints, every magnetic polarity diagram, every copper winding specification, every regulatory loophole permitting installation in most jurisdictions exist entirely in the public domain. Why has this functional technology, validated in working prototypes since 2014, been aggressively excised from the global energy dialogue? It is not a cartoonish conspiracy. It is a terrifyingly mundane structural alignment of financial incentives. In 1992, the Energy Policy Act birthed the production tax credit. It subsidized utility-scale wind generation. Over 2 decades, this federal credit was renewed and expanded 11 times. Each expansion was legally drafted and lobbied for by organizations that represent the massive horizontal axis turbines the size of football fields. Their entire corporate survival depends on framing atmospheric kinetic energy strictly as a utility-scale infrastructure investment, never as a homeowner appliance. They defend the monopoly. When the Department of Energy distributed research capital in the early 2010s, the funding flowed exclusively toward conventional small turbines, the spinning, multi-bladed relics. Research into bladeless tech was unequivocally denied federal funding. The stated bureaucratic rationale cited an insufficient technology readiness level. That exact same year, the government awarded $13 million to a corporate consortium exclusively developing blade pitch algorithms for utility-scale giants. The capital flows where the capital has historically flowed. The Amish, naturally, completely ignore these bureaucratic machinations. They do not lobby. They erect the mast, and it functions. This reveals the most vital sociological truth of the technology. The most resilient demographics in North America are the Old Order Amish and Mennonites. During the catastrophic Texas freeze of February 2021, when 4.5 million modern consumers abruptly lost power and 246 individuals died of hypothermia, the agrarian grid defectors remained illuminated. They systematically reject the centralized dependency model that modern society relies upon for survival. They did not reject electrical current based on theological doctrine. They rejected ownership by the grid. There is a profound distinction. An Amish family will utilize a photovoltaic cell on a carriage. They will wire a chemical battery in a workshop. They will bolt a kinetic vortex generator to a dairy barn. They will absolutely not sign a legal contract binding them as a subordinate customer to an external power authority. That specific agrarian distinction dictates sheer survival as residential utility rates ruthlessly compound. Average electricity prices have violently outpaced baseline inflation over the last 6 years. In certain jurisdictions, the residential rate now exceeds 30 or even 40 cents per kilowatt hour. An average household consuming 900 kilowatt hours monthly bleeds $150 every 30 days. Over the projected 36-year lifespan of a single carbon fiber vortex mast, that household will surrender over $64,000 to the regional monopoly. A single $90 device, offsetting a mere fraction of that consumption, returns $20,000 in avoided costs. The mathematics are absolute. Can you power an entire modern estate with a single stick? Absolutely not. A single unit yields 1.5 kilowatt-hours daily against a national average consumption of 30. But the structural advantage is replication. You can bolt 6 units along a standard roof ridge in a single afternoon for under $600. You immediately offset 30% of your daily consumption. Combine that kinetic array with a fractional solar installation, and you achieve 70% self-generation. The financial payback period shrinks to 36 months. This is exactly what the Amish carpenter accomplished. 3 vortex masts on the barn, 2 photovoltaic panels on the workshop, 6 salvaged lead-acid golf cart batteries sealed in a cedar box to safely absorb vented hydrogen gas. He invested exactly $1,200 sequentially. That array covers 80% of his electrical demand, supplemented briefly by a small combustion generator during absolute winter calms. The legacy utility wire still physically runs from the roadside pole to his barn structure. It simply connects to nothing. The local meter reader arrives annually, out of pure bureaucratic habit, stares at the severed junction, shrugs, and drives away. The cord is cut. In the summer of 1937, the United States Department of Agriculture circulated Farmer's Bulletin, number 1789. It was meticulously detailed to instruct on the construction of small-scale kinetic generators using localized materials, distributed free of charge to 200,000 American homesteads. By 1946, the Rural Electrification Administration had successfully dragged standardized copper grid wire to 70% of those farms. The bulletin was quietly erased from the government's recommended reading list. It was never formally retracted. It was simply starved of ink. The profound knowledge of how a citizen could harvest localized atmospheric energy was not actively destroyed. It was allowed to become socially inconvenient. In a civilization aggressively optimized for consumer convenience, inconvenient knowledge evaporates within a single generation. The Amish retained it because they discard nothing. You forgot because you were told forgetting was progress. The engineer in Spain and the carpenter in Pennsylvania will never cross paths. One is a formally credentialed aerospace expert holding a doctorate. The other is an old order agrarian with an 8th grade education. Yet, navigating from the absolute opposite ends of modern human civilization, they have isolated the exact same machine. The mechanism functions because the underlying physics dictates it must. The fluid dynamics have not deviated a fraction of a degree since the equations were mathematically solidified in 1911. The ambient wind fractures. The vertical stick oscillates. The internal magnets aggressively bypass the copper coils. The electrical current freely flows. That is the entirety of the transaction. The ultimate barrier is not mechanical. The absolute hardest part of this kinetic revolution is forcibly unlearning the deeply conditioned assumption that energy must inherently originate from a distant, centralized facility owned by a corporate monopoly, billed monthly, and metered down to the fractional kilowatt hour. That psychological dependency was not handed down from the laws of thermodynamics. It was systematically manufactured in the late 19th century. The architecture of the modern electrical utility was designed not through engineering genius, but through financial captivity. The pioneers of the grid perfectly understood a profound structural truth. If electrical generation could be physically centralized, it could be heavily capitalized. If it could be capitalized, it could be fiercely regulated. And if it could be regulated, the state would legally guarantee its rate of return. The societal contract was brutal in its simplicity. Utilities accepted government regulation in direct exchange for absolute monopoly. Citizens accepted the monopoly in exchange for promised reliability. Consequently, small-scale, distributed kinetic generation, which successfully powered tens of thousands of American homesteads through the 1920s, was quietly legislated into oblivion. When the government forcefully dragged subsidized copper poles to 9 out of 10 American farms within a single decade, it was championed as a monumental triumph of public infrastructure. It was simultaneously the precise moment the localized wind harvester was executed. Brilliant independent inventors watched their customer bases vanish overnight. Their beautifully engineered residential turbines did not fail. Many continue to spin flawlessly today in isolated territories, brutally engineered to survive half a century. They were rendered entirely obsolete by accounting, not by entropy. This is the exact historical graveyard this modern bladeless patent stepped into. It was not inventing a novel physical force. It was resurrecting a principle the global energy monopoly had spent 80 years aggressively forgetting. The pioneers of massive offshore wind farms dismiss vortex-induced vibration as a curiosity that will never scale. They are technically accurate, yet strategically blind. Vortex generators will never scale upward to form gigawatt offshore arrays, because that is not their physical purpose. They scale in the exact opposite direction. They scale downward. They scale to the individual household. They scale to the isolated dairy barn. They scale to the residential fence post. They scale to the precise, localized level. The centralized grid was explicitly designed to eradicate. The ultimate threat to the utility is not mechanical. The threat is entirely sociological. A single household harvesting $90 of independent kinetic electricity per month has partially seceded from the regulated economy. Multiply that secession by 40 million homes, and the guaranteed rate of return collapses. Distribution monopolies do not die from direct competition. They die from irrelevance. We must dissect the remaining counter-arguments with absolute clinical honesty, because ignoring friction destroys credibility. The first immediate objection is capacity. A single residential mast operating in average wind conditions of 4 to 6 meters per second will generate between 100 and 400 watt-hours daily. That will not power a modern refrigeration unit. It is strictly enough to run a localized LED circuit, a communications charger, or a 12-volt agricultural water pump. To operate a heavy modern household, you require an array. For a standard home with induction cooktops and deep freezers, you require between 18 and 32 synchronized masts. That scales the total material cost to roughly $2,000. That is still mathematically less than 10% of a comparable photovoltaic installation. It demands zero roof penetration. It requires zero interconnection agreements with your hostile utility. The second counter-argument is material fatigue. Does a carbon fiber mast inevitably shatter after millions of oscillations? Under rigorous university supervision, highly accelerated kinetic degradation testing was conducted. The empirical data is absolute. Aerospace-grade pultruded carbon fiber rods comfortably withstand 240 million flexural cycles before registering any measurable degradation. At a typical resonance operating 6 productive hours a day, that translates to 75 years of continuous mechanical survival. The neodymium magnets encapsulated in epoxy are functionally eternal at ambient temperatures. The varnished copper stator will completely outlive the homeowner. The solitary consumable piece of this entire architecture is the $4 polyurethane base bushing. A modern diesel generator demands fresh oil every 200 hours. A lithium battery decays to 80% capacity within a single decade. A bladeless kinetic mast depreciates on a timeline significantly longer than the 30-year mortgage of the structure it powers. The final objection is purely aesthetic, and it cannot be defeated with metallurgical data. The masts physically sway. They emit a deeply low-frequency acoustic hum at absolute resonance. Suburban homeowners associations are already weaponizing their covenants, strictly classifying these vertical masts as prohibited structures. This is the most glaringly honest admission of the modern suburban regime. A neighborhood that legally protects the existence of gas-powered leaf blowers screaming at 85 decibels will explicitly ban a silent, vibrating stick if it allows a citizen to permanently escape the utility bill. It is an economic objection wearing a superficial aesthetic costume. Rural agricultural zoning codes harbor no such restrictions. If you possess acreage outside municipal limits, you can erect a kinetic array tomorrow morning with absolute impunity. The threshold to initiate this process is now mathematically lower than the threshold to procrastinate. The full invoice for a single experimental unit is brutally stark. 1 pultruded carbon fiber rod, 4N52 neodymium magnets, 300 grams of enameled copper wire, 1 polyurethane bushing, a span of PVC pipe and a marine plywood base, a Schottky bridge rectifier, and a highly basic charge controller. Your total capital expenditure is exactly $88. If you have never wound a copper stator in your life, and you commit every reasonable amateur error, the initial build consumes exactly one Saturday. By your fourth unit, with the physical winding sequence memorized, assembly collapses to under 3 hours. A retired electrician in Vermont utilized a printed physical manual to assemble his first unit. He has now manufactured nearly 100 masts. He donated 70 to his rural neighbors. He powers his entire heated workshop with the remaining units humming quietly along his property line. He possesses no internet connection. The centralized grid has already consumed its designated century. The solitary remaining question is whether you possess the resolve to test the physics yourself. This weekend, hours before the next atmospheric pressure system rolls across your specific latitude, walk out to the absolute highest elevation of your property. Fasten a lightweight ribbon to a rigid stick. Hold it vertically against the sky. Watch it. If that ribbon violently flutters for more than half the afternoon, you possess a massive, untapped kinetic resource. The required capital is $90. The afternoon belongs to you. We spend our lives engineering colossal, rotating structures to desperately slice the sky, blinded by a monumental kinetic illusion. True atmospheric power does not require severing the wind. You merely have to let it shake the stick.